Welcome back to our virtual pilgrimage, our pilgrimage of freedom here in the desert after our Exodus. We are now going into the second part of our pilgrimage, as I mentioned before. We're going to be talking about each commandment. And so where are we right now? We've decided to come to this desert area in the Negev, where we're very close to Egypt. In fact, also very close to Jordan. I'm looking at the mountains right in front of me right now of Jordan. Beautiful tall mountains reminding me of Sinai. Right this direction is Egypt. We've just come out of there and we are making our way through the desert as we're learning to walk the way of the Lord. What does it mean to be His chosen ones? And so as we come to this place, we're in front of a temple, the temple of Hathor or Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of copper mining. And so join me as we go into the First Commandment, looking at this really unique place of sacrifice here in the desert. So what can we see behind me in front of this huge sandstone cliff? All of the sandstone is eroding and becoming this gorgeous reddish sand beneath my feet with the wind and with the rain. And it is the perfect place to have put a temple. You see a square shape behind us, and then you almost see like a dais over which maybe there was an altar. But certainly in the cliff you can see carved out a niche. So archaeologists, when they uncovered this, think that in that niche was placed the god named Hathor. This goddess, actually, was the one who protected the miners. This was a big copper mining area. And so this was a place where they could come and exercise their right of worship and ask for protection. It was not enjoyable to be a copper miner, and hopefully we can talk about that a little bit further in the future. But she was the protector of all of them. So down here, you not only see stones, but you see this niche and you can see this dais. And we have to remember that the Egyptians did not have really animal sacrifice and to any extent at all. What they did is, of course, they had incense that they would burn to the gods, but mostly the priests of their religion would dress and put to sleep and wake up the gods that were in those boats, in those great big temples that we saw back along the Nile. And so here, there was probably the same type of thing, the statue of a goddess that people would come and give worship to protect them. So right next to me, you see these almost cliff faces where they've put in stairs that you can make your way up to, almost like a patio, a dais. Not a dais as much as it would be a balcony, where the religious leader, the priest or the priestess would be up there probably addressing the people as they were here. I don't know if they would address them, but certainly watching over the temple and pointing to the image of the goddess, which is on this flat rock up there at the top. When you get close, you can still make out the figure of the goddess. There's incense in her hand, and there's also the name of the pharaoh, also giving cult to her. And so it's very interesting that she's there, and the image, after more than 3,000 years in sandstone, which wears away so quickly, it's still visible. And so we'll take you up there so you can see it. And so there's not, I think, a better place in this part of the desert to speak about the First Commandment than this. So the First Commandment, what is it? What does it say? Well, if we look at Exodus 20 and also Deuteronomy 5, this is the definition that we receive. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And then it continues, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. So this graven image, it's probably carved into that sandstone by the workers themselves. If they were slaves of the Egyptians that came from these parts, perhaps they learned to carve it from stories that they were told. Or perhaps they were Egyptians who fell into slavery for any number of reasons. A lot of the world back at that time were slaves. And so they made this image hoping one day to be free. And so if you can imagine the Israelites coming through here and resonating in their minds and their hearts as the first part of the covenant, these very First Commandments, the very first three, 1, 2, and 3, speak about their relationship directly with the Lord. And so this is the first one. You shall have no other gods before me, no graven images. Do not bow down before any of these images. And if they would see this, it could serve as a temptation. It could serve also as a remembrance of the covenant they have with the true God. But it really shakes them up and reminds them of exactly the first part of this, which we spoke about. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Oh my gosh, I'm seeing again the house of bondage, the symbols of my slavery. I am the one who did this to you. In fact, it was at that moment that we spoke about before that the Israelites became a people. It wasn't at Genesis, it wasn't the creation, it was actually at the Exodus that they had their identity. So this is our first commandment. And it helps us to hear the call of the Lord. It's me, don't forget. So we have to open our ears to that. God comes searching for us, and he'll use everything. A temple, a goddess, an idol, to remind us that he is the true God. This woman, this goddess, could not part the Red Sea and bring them out. In fact, she was the goddess of, more than anything, of slaves. But God, he's the God of freedom. So this is a place when they hear the call again. And probably they raise their voices up to the Lord so he can hear them. This is a place where they remember he is searching for them. He searched for them in the past. And God heard the call of the slaves. So perhaps they were thinking, these poor people also who are slaves, praying to this goddess to protect them, but who's not powerful enough to bring them out of slavery. If only they knew our God. If only they could be part of this covenant. I'm sure that's part of what they were speaking about. And so Christians also hear the words of Jesus himself, who said in Matthew 4, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him alone shall you serve. And so it's bringing us to this realization that other peoples come to know and love the Lord. That is our mission. That was their mission. And so he saved the Israelites so that all nations would come to know and love him. Now, one of the first Christians was Justin Martyr. He lived at the end of the first century. I think he was born maybe in the year 100. And so this is what he's telling a Jewish friend of his regarding the Lord. Now, he's giving a really strong testimony of who the true God is. He says, there will never be another God, Trifo, and there has been no other since the world began. No other than he who made and ordered the universe. We Christians, we do not think that our God is different from yours. He is the same who brought your fathers out of Egypt by his powerful hand and his outstretched arm. We do not place our hope in some other God, for there is none, but in the same God as you do, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This first commandment, just like Justin Martyr says, know him. Who is God? How much do I know my faith? How much do I know him in theology, but also in relationship? How do we do that? As it says at the very beginning of this commandment, to see and to remember what he has done. The Red Sea, Mount Sinai, when it was shaking, the covenant, the miracles were real that happened back then. Now, sometimes we need to be shaken up a bit. And I remember when I was visiting home once, there was a new parish priest at the cathedral from India. We were struggling to understand him. He had a very strong accent. But there was one point when everybody in the church, it was during a daily mass, so not everybody was there, but everybody was focused on him. Because he started talking about a man in his hometown who was born with a birth defect, had one leg shorter than the other. And he said that his mother went, the mother of this young man went and prayed to the Lord to heal him. And as they were praying, the leg of this boy grew in front of their eyes and he was restored to health. And so you might think, okay, well, what an interesting story. But everyone was focused on him when he said, and that boy is me. And you could hear a pin drop in that church. It's nothing that he will forget, of course. His family won't forget it. His mother won't forget it. But now the parishioners at that church, we can't forget it. When we remember the miracles that God has done, we're like, oh, He is God. He is the one that we worship. He says, I am the Lord. I brought you out. I give you life. So know me. Enter into relationship with me. And don't continue running and hiding like Adam and Eve did. Don't look to the gods of Egypt, who was right before them, the temple, her temple right before them, even in this poor place, this desert. Don't look to the gods of Canaan. Don't look to the gods of the peoples of this area. I am the Lord. It is me. Know your faith. Know the gospel. And how privileged we all are to get to know the fifth gospel, where the Lord lived, where the history of salvation happened. Not just with Jesus, but the history of salvation from the very beginning. So to know our faith, in fact, it's a baptismal duty that comes from this first commandment. We can't really reject what we don't know first. Say, no, I'm not a Christian. This is a post-Christian society. It's like saying, oh, I'm a post-iPhone person. And maybe you're an Android person, but get to know all the different things in the iPhone before you completely reject it. This was something I had to do with my mother. So with the faith, even more so, because it's absolutely essential to our life. This is our first commandment. And not knowing the faith that we've been given through our baptism can happen because of a deliberate move. We just don't want to. We might be lazy. We're just neglectful. And it's one of the main things that can happen in the world today. Am I somebody that helps others to know the faith? Do I look for it myself? And it's interesting when we start to know the Lord and learn more about salvation history, there's a resonance inside, and it kind of draws us further into knowing the Lord. And that's exactly what he wants. He doesn't want us to live some type of spiritual anorexia, never being fed, becoming fragile and sickly. So, well, actually, many times it's more like a spiritual lack of nutrition because we're workaholics. We just don't take the time, even when it feeds us and even when it resonates with who we are. So it's very easy to do this. So you can ask yourself, does it really matter? Does it really matter? That's like saying to the Israelites who have come out of Egypt, why don't you just stay there? Does it really matter? Does it really matter that you'll continue to be a slave for the rest of your life? And that those that you know and love, your family and your friends, will continue to be slaves? Does it really matter? Let's take seriously what these commandments tell us. And you can say, well, leave if I just have to come here where there's nothing but rock, a few acacia trees that are filled with thorns, heat. Why? It's a way to enter into relationship with the true God, to become deeply and internally and eternally free. So the first commandment is definitely a call for us to live faith. It's the way that we become truly in covenant with the Lord. But the first commandment also is a way for us to live hope. And hope is the opposite of despair. And you can imagine the people coming through here, how often they despaired. We read that in Exodus. They constantly were complaining. But many times the despair that we feel is because we don't feel like we can be forgiven. If you think of the biggest sin or the most embarrassing sin that you've ever committed, and we all have them, and we always think at the end of our life, will there really be a movie, which they show, that everybody's going to watch and see and be like, oh, wow. When our Lord forgives, he forgets, right? But when we feel like we cannot be forgiven, despair takes over. And so the first commandment reminds us that we can't be forgiven. It doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter how much we hide. The only one that can save us and forgive us is him. Only he can do this. And it's because he is good. And I only know that he is good when I start to get to know him in relationship and my faith grows. So this is knowing his goodness. Project Rachel, which I think is a beautiful apostolic work, reaches out to men and women and families who have been involved with abortion. Sometimes, we can be very flippant about the sixth commandment, taking one's life. And I often think, 1 out of 3 women has had an abortion. We've got to be careful with that. And these women and the men involved with it many times think that they cannot be forgiven. And what they do through Project Rachel is get them to understand how good God is. How good God is and how dignified they can be when they stand in forgiveness. So that's a really important lesson from the First Commandment. Another thing that can happen, which probably happened to the people coming through the desert, was presumption. And that means I really just don't need God. Why would I need him? In fact, all of us in Western society many times think we don't need him. I'm not a slave in Egypt right now. And I'll get to the end of life, many times people might say, and oh yeah, then I'll remember God. And I'll be like, okay, bring in the priest or send somebody in, or I'll say my final prayers. And then I'll ask for help. Well, this is difficult because the way we live is the way that we die. And so we have to remember how much we do need him. And so one of the things we can do is recognize this need, even if we don't feel it, and let him come and help us. So as the First Commandment invites us to live faith and hope, it also invites us, of course, to live charity, the 3 theological virtues. And charity is a whole second half of the Decalogue. And so it helps us to see God in others. That's what it means, the First Commandment. To bow before them, as C.S. Lewis says in his great book, The Great Divorce, where this great procession comes in and everybody's bowing before this person, and the one who's visiting heaven from hell says, "Who is this, the Virgin Mary?" And they say, no, this is your next door neighbor. There is greatness in the person next to me because they have the image of God inside. And so we love God because we love them because they also have God. And we love God because he also loves all of the people around us. And so much he has done for them, so much he has done for me. And I remember in my own life, it was only after an 8-day silent retreat that I started really meditating and had a really specific prayer, giving thanks to God for all the graces he had given me in my life. It was during the time of the great massacre in Rwanda, and I thought to myself, Lord, why was I born in the United States? Why wasn't I born a Hutu or a Tutsi and either killing or being killed? Why? Why? And I just went through my friends and my family, the faith I'd been given, all of the graces I had received, and said, oh, I've been given so much, and how can I thank you? I can give you what I have, and that's my life. My life. And so when we think about and reflect on how much God has done for us or how much he has done for others, we can't stay in indifference. We cannot. We cannot neglect to reflect on this, on God and on love. So the First Commandment also helps us or cautions us against something called acedia. That's spiritual sloth. It's that noonday devil when we're actually following the Lord, but then we get tired of it. And that's when joy actually sort of disappears from following him. It happened in the desert, man. They were not joyful. They were not joyful. And in fact, they experienced being repelled by divine goodness. This happened to many people, including the great Saint Mother Teresa, the great Saint Therese of Lisieux. It happens to everyone. And so we have to keep walking and keep going and keep believing in the Lord and keep loving him and others. Finally, there's something that comes from pride. And this can also happen to great saints, and that is a sense of hatred of God. This is totally contrary to the love of God because it denies his goodness. It denies his very being. And so when that happens, there needs to be an examination deep inside and saying, okay, my gosh, what is going on inside of me, Lord? Help me to come back to knowing you and going deeper in my knowledge of you. So in this part of our pilgrimage of freedom is when I invite you to take out a notebook and have 2 different sides or 2 different sections. In fact, it could be 2 pages facing one another if you write small. And each day we'll have a reflection that will help us to write, in a sense, our own Decalogue. In other words, what are the words that the Lord is talking to me about to lead me into freedom? And so there's some reflections perhaps that will help us to live according to the First Commandment. Number 1, how much do I know my faith? And what can I do to know it better? To know him, to know what he's taught me, to know the history of salvation. I know a number of people who have started the resolution of reading the Bible in a year or listening to a podcast of the Bible in a year. Getting to know a history of salvation, let you experience what's happening to the people in the Bible. Secondly, asking for help, asking for forgiveness from the Lord. Sloth, indifference, laziness, pride, all of these things that keep us from acknowledging him and knowing him. Asking for help from someone else to help us do that. And thirdly, one of the things that was very popular years ago and even has a song that goes with it is 1,000 Reasons. Reflect on a reason a day, 2 reasons a day, the things that come to your mind at the end of the day of how you've been blessed, of how the Lord has helped you. The good that you see in yourself and the goodness around you in people and in events. Because this helps us to see God and see his action and therefore love him, as the First Commandment tells us. So as we're here in the desert and the sun sets behind us, or actually it sets in front of us and reflects on the beautiful mountains behind us, I want to thank you for joining us as we get into the second part of our pilgrimage of freedom, as we continue to make our exodus every single day and get to know the Lord even more and get to know the covenant that we're living with him by living and learning about these commandments. Thank you. And know that we're praying for you. From here, we prayed for you today. Actually, our whole team did. And we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. And God bless you.